Good morning, girls. Today we're looking at week 5, looking at God as an eternal God. I've already heard from a few of you who have said this chapter has been very good for you to read through. And this chapter has been particularly enlightening to me as well. So I'm glad to hear from you, and I'm glad God's doing some great things through this book, None Like Him, written by Jen Wilkin. Now, for me, though, the things that the Lord has brought to light might be slightly different than the things that he's brought to light for you. I don't think that it's irony, and I don't think that it's coincidental that the Lord used this very time studying God as an eternal God to kind of bring a light bulb moment to me. You see, we're talking about this week, or Jen wrote this week, about God being eternal God and it being specific to the issue of time. And she brought out quite a bit about how we are very bothered at times and frustrated at times that God's timing is not our timing, that a lot of things actually happen outside of our time frame, maybe things that happen generationally after we are long gone. And we wrestle with that. I know that we do. I know that I do. But in particular, the thing that stuck out to me is how it relates to God as an infinite God. You see, every time I came to this book and every time I came to these 2 chapters, I could not figure out how to separate and talk about them differently. As I talk about God as an infinite God, it was always something that I hit my head up against. Why would Jen be repetitious and talk about God as an eternal God? And no matter how many times I looked at it, no matter how many times I read through it, and no matter how many times I tried to come at it from a different angle, I always found myself talking about the same stuff. I always found the same things coming out at me from the page and couldn't figure out how to talk about God as an infinite God and make it different in talking about God as an eternal God. And just like that, the Lord brought a light bulb moment for me. Hopefully, you figured this one out a long time ago. But as for me, I had to go back and listen to the first video that I had given on God as an infinite God. Fortunately, as I listened, there wasn't anything unbiblical that I said. But I think that I was, at least in my mind, kind of geared in the wrong direction. And let me give you the reason why. The light bulb that the Lord gave to me was, as I studied the word infinite and eternal, yes, these things can mean endless as it pertains to time. But what infinite talks about that goes a little bit beyond eternal is the idea of limitations. So when we talk about God as an infinite God, I think what I was missing was the aspect of putting a heavier weight on God being limitless. I was about ready to say limitlessness, but that was too many S's. Limitless. So we have boundaries, we have limitations. For example, time, but God is not bound to our time frame. But when we look at this entire book being built upon God as an infinite God, I think what Jen is trying to actually draw out is God being a limitless God. So when we talk about things like his incomprehensibility, the idea is there is no limit to what we could know about God. When we talk about God being self-sufficient, we're talking about there is no limit. God is sufficient in himself. He has no limitations. He doesn't need anything from us. When we talk about God being as a self-existent God, there is no limit to his existence, either before or after our own life. When we go further and talk about God as a sovereign God, or God as a powerful God, or the things that God knows, omniscience, or where God is, omnipresence, you see, there is no limit to God. And that is the emphasis that is put on God as an infinite God. So as I looked back and at the first video, I talked about God being from everlasting to everlasting. That holds true for who God is. But I think that in my mind, that was more focused on God's eternality. He existed, or he lived from everlasting to everlasting. The idea of infinite, though, this limitlessness that God has, this no boundary that God has, these attributes that have no limit, I would liken it to when Jesus is on the boat with the disciples and the storm is just knocking these guys senseless. They go down into the boat and they find Jesus sleeping, and they're like, "Really, dude? Can you not come and do something about this?" You see, what Jesus does is he remains calm. He's not reactionary to the circumstances of the moment. He steps up top on the boat and he looks around at the storm, the winds, the rain, and he says, "Peace, be still." And immediately there is a calmness. You see, God has no limit. God is not limited by the circumstances of life. He's not limited in power. He was able to go beyond the power of the storm. God is not limited by knowledge. He knows beyond what we know to be true in this world. It was hard for me to separate then that there is no limit to God as it relates to time. And that is his eternality. And I would liken this to what Jen even brought up in the book, that he is the Alpha and the Omega. See, that's time. Or we've often referred to the Lord as the Ancient of Days. Time. This is everlasting to everlasting. It's a time thing. So that was my light bulb moment for this week. When we talk about God as a limitless God, he is infinite. When we separate God as an eternal God, he is everlasting to everlasting. He is not bound by time in the same sense that we are. And so for me, that was my light bulb moment. That was the turnaround for me, recognizing the difference between infinite and eternal. Hopefully for you, I haven't confused you too much on this issue. And hopefully you're able to go back and listen to the video on infinite and be able to hear that concept of everlasting to everlasting. And although not wrong, it kind of applies more to this week on God being an eternal God as it refers to time. Everlasting to everlasting. Alpha, Omega. The Ancient of Days. He was and is to come. And so that's the difference. And like I said, I don't think that it's a coincidence that the Lord brought it up right now, because here we are talking about time. God doesn't do things within our own time frame. And I look back to the previous video and think, wouldn't it have been so much better if that light bulb moment would have happened way back then, so that this entire book and this entire series, as I have had the opportunity to teach it or even work with some of you ladies in small groups, wouldn't it have been better for that piece of the puzzle to have been in place 6 weeks ago? But here God is saying, no, not that moment, this moment right here. And so for whatever reason, God's timing in the issue, for whatever purposes he has that I may not see on this earth, but may see later, and maybe it's only for the purpose of reminding me that he's going to do what he's going to do when he's going to do it for my good and for his glory. Or maybe just to bring out a nuance from the study that we've had together about how God is who he is, and he does things when he does them for a purpose, on purpose, even when we don't know what that purpose is. Hopefully that's drawn out for you as it was drawn out for me. So this week, look back at the video on infinite and look at it as a God who is eternal, not bound by time like we are. And then keep it tabbed in your mind that that word infinite means that it's limitless. Yes, in time, which is where I got confused, but not solely on time. He is limitless in all of his attributes. Does that clear it up for you? Hopefully it does. It cleared it up for me. So this week it's a short one, but hopefully it's a good one. So read your book again, look at infinite, look at eternal. Don't make the same mistake that I did. Don't try to intertwine the two, but try to look at them separately for what they are, because both are marvelous attributes of God. And yes, they work in tandem, but it's always good for us to investigate the details, to be a little bit more in awe of who God is. And that's where I am today. So girls, let's look at God as a limitless God. And then specifically this week, let's look at him as unlimited in time. He can do anything he wants, anytime he wants for his purposes. And let's give him the glory for that.